So this is just a basic introduction to genetics. We're just going to introduce some basic vocabulary and basic concepts that must be understood to really understand genetics. So let's start with what genetics is all about, and that is our genes, and not just our genes, but any organism's genes. But basically what a gene is, it's a section of DNA that actually codes for our traits. So we have various traits, and they're all coded for in our instruction manual, which is known as DNA. And you can kind of think of DNA like a filing cabinet that just has all these files in it. And each one of those files can be considered a gene. Each one of those files has instructions for a specific trait, and those are referred to in scientific terminology as a gene. Our DNA is actually structured in something called chromosomes. So each one of our cells that contains all of our DNA, the form of that DNA is in this structure called chromosomes. And this is showing human chromosomes. We have 23 pairs. So as you know, you get your DNA from mom and dad. You get them from your parents. So we get one chromosome from mom and one chromosome from dad for each type of chromosome. So here is like chromosome 1. You get one from mom, one from dad. Here's chromosome 2. You get one from mom, one from dad. Chromosome 3, one from mom, one from dad, so on and so on. And we have 23 pairs of those. And the last pair, the 23rd pair, is actually our sex chromosomes, our X and Y, or X and X as in a female. And this is what really determines our sex, if we are male or female. And we will talk about this later in a different lesson. But just understand that the structures of our DNA are chromosomes. And each one of these chromosomes contains many genes on it. So a gene might be found on chromosome 4. Some other genes might be found on chromosome 8. And some other ones might be found on chromosome 16. So our genes are actually found within our chromosomes at specific locations. Okay, so let's talk about this weird word here called allele. This is one that students forget a lot. And basically it just has to do with different types of the same gene. So let's pretend we're talking about the gene for eye color. There's going to be different versions of that. So there could be a blue allele, a brown allele, a green allele. So each of those would code for a different type of the same gene. Another one could be hair color. So let's say different alleles for hair color could be brown hair, blonde hair, red hair, auburn hair, so on and so on. So it's just different forms of a single gene. And it's found on the exact same spot on a chromosome. So this is representing a chromosome, this X here. And the gene is found right here. So let's say this was from mom and this one's from dad. It's found in the same spot, but you might get a different version from mom than you do from dad for that gene. So alleles is represented here, just kind of like different colors of a single gene. And don't think it specifically as colors, this is just an example. So let's talk about the two main types of alleles that you kind of need to understand. And that is a dominant allele versus something called a recessive allele, which we'll talk about next. The dominant allele, so if you think of the word dominant, you think of something that's really strong or stronger than something else. And that's basically what it means in this sense as well. This allele is actually stronger than other alleles. So if you pair a dominant allele to a non-dominant allele, the dominant one is going to win. The phenotype, or the trait that's expressed by the dominant allele, is going to be expressed regardless what the other allele is, because it's stronger. And we'll talk about that in a second. But just remember, the dominant allele is the stronger allele. The recessive allele is the weaker allele. Okay, and in a minute when we talk about what homozygous and heterozygous is, this will make a little bit more sense. But the only way this can ever be expressed is as if you have two of them. If you have one of them and a dominant allele, the dominant one's always going to win. Okay, so right now just understand the dominant allele is the stronger allele and the recessive allele is the weaker allele. Okay, so let's talk about homozygous and heterozygous, so this might make a little bit more sense. So the way you represent a dominant allele is with a capital letter. So let's just use the letter H for the heck of it. We're just going to pick a letter. So here is the dominant allele. It would be represented by a capital H. Okay. Now the recessive allele would be lowercase. So the dominant's always uppercase, the recessive's always lowercase. So to be homozygous, you have to have the same alleles for a trait. And remember before I said you get 2 chromosomes for every chromosome pair. You get one from mom and one from dad. That means every gene you have 2 versions of it. Because you get one version from mom and one version from dad. One allele from mom, one allele from dad. And in order to be homozygous, they need to be the same. So that means you would either have to have 2 capitals, which would be homozygous dominant because you have 2 dominants, or you would be homozygous recessive because you would have 2 recessive. So this would be homozygous, having 2 of the same. Heterozygous, on the other hand, is when you have different alleles for a trait. So this person would have a capital and one of the lower cases. So they would have 1 dominant allele and 1 recessive allele. So that would be heterozygous. So again, homozygous is when you have the same. So you can have homozygous dominant or homozygous recessive. Those are the only 2 options for homozygous. And heterozygous only has 1 option. You have 1 big and 1 little. Okay? And this can be any letter depending on what trait you're talking about. I just chose H. You could use A or B or C, whatever. But just the thing you really need to know is the dominant is always a capital letter. The recessive is always a lowercase letter. And you can either have homozygous, which is the same, or heterozygous, which is different. Okay? And a way you can remember this is homo and hetero. So everyone's heard of homosexual, heterosexual. Homosexual is 2 of the same sexes. Okay? So that's homo. It's the same. Just as here, you got 2 of the same here, 2 of the same here. Hetero is 2 opposite sexes or 2 different sexes. Same here, different. It's 2 different alleles. That's what homo and hetero means. Homo means same, hetero means different. So if you can associate it with that, it'll help you remember that because it's something you know. That's what you should always do with stuff with science, is try to relate it to something you know to help you remember. Okay? So right now we know dominant, we know recessive, we know homozygous, we know heterozygous. Okay? So let me give you an example kind of what that means. And I'm going to write down here, and it doesn't have anything to do with what's on the screen. I just need somewhere to write really quick. So let's say we're going to do eye color. So let's do brown eyes as the dominant. So we're going to make that capital B, and we're just going to use the little letter B. And let's say blue eyes are recessive. Okay? So brown is dominant, blue is recessive. So let's talk about what that means. If you have someone that has 2 big B's, so 2 dominant alleles, they're going to have 1 brown allele and another brown allele. That means their eye color is going to be brown. Right? Let's say you have someone that has 2 little b's. Okay? So they have 2 blue-eyed alleles. That person is going to have blue eyes because they don't have any other option. They just have 2 blue alleles. This one has 2 brown alleles. They're going to be that color. Now, the trick is if you have 1 of each. The heterozygous. If you have 1 brown allele, or one brown allele, which is dominant, and 1 blue allele, which is recessive, remember we said dominant always wins. So that means the big B is actually going to almost cancel out the little b. So that means this person is still going to have brown eyes. Even though they do have a blue allele, it's hidden because the brown is dominant. Okay, so that's kind of what's meant by dominant and recessive. All right, 2 other words you need to know, and then we're going to do a couple practice problems just to kind of reiterate what we've talked about. Phenotype. Phenotype has to do with physical traits. Okay, eye color, skin color, height. This could be even like blood type, something you can't see. It's still a physical trait. And you can remember because of this pH, which sounds like pH of physical, right? Phenotype is physical traits. On the other hand, genotype, what's that sound like? It sounds like genes. That has to do with the genes. That has to do with the alleles that we just talked about. Genotype is the alleles. It's the code that tells us what our phenotype is going to be. So our phenotype is actually dependent on what the genotype is. But the genotype just has to do with the genes, the DNA, the alleles. The phenotype has to do with the actual traits that are coded for in these alleles or these genes. Okay, so there's two more kind of vocab words you need to understand. So let's do a couple examples here. Whoops. All right, for each genotype below, so here's our genotypes. These are our alleles. So you see all kinds of dominant and recessive alleles here. What we're going to do is we're going to indicate whether it's heterozygous, and remember heterozygous means different, or if it's homozygous. And remember homozygous means the same. And you can have two types of homozygous. You can have two dominants, which would be homozygous dominant, or you can have two recessive, which is homozygous recessive. So let's go through a couple of these. Here you have two uppercase A's. So you have two dominants, and they're the same. And remember, the same is homozygous. So this is going to be homozygous, and it's two dominants, so it's going to be homozygous dominant. I'm sorry, my handwriting is going to be kind of bad on this. Here you have two different ones. So that's going to be heterozygous. Here again, you have a big I and a little I. That's two different ones, heterozygous. Here's another heterozygous, and another heterozygous. Okay, here's two of the same again, so that's homozygous, and it's two dominants, so it's going to be a D. Let's find a homozygous. Here's a homozygous recessive. They're the same, so they're homozygous, but they're both recessive, so it's with an R. Same here, these two little O's, homozygous, recessive. Okay, so you could go through and label all of these because you know what homozygous and heterozygous means. And heterozygous, you never have to say if it's dominant or recessive because it has both, so you don't have to say that. This is the only heterozygous there can be. The only time you have to say if it's dominant or recessive is when it's two of the same, when it's homozygous. Because I don't know here, if you just said homozygous, I don't know if it's two dominants or if it's two recessive, so you have to specify. So now what we're going to do is we're going to say what the phenotype is based on the genotype. So here we have purple flowers are dominant. So this is the dominant, and white is recessive. So here we have a dominant allele, which is purple, and a recessive allele, which is white, and dominant always wins. So this is going to be purple. Here you have two uppercase, which are two dominant, and since the dominant's purple, it's going to be purple. Here you have two little p's, so you have two recessives, so you have two whites. That means it can be white. You're only going to see the recessive allele if you have two recessive alleles. Here, the recessive allele is hidden by the dominant gene, the dominant allele. So you show the dominant trait. Okay. Let's do one more and we'll move on. This says bobtails in cats are recessive. So that means bobtails are recessive. So that means no bobtails are dominant. Okay. With the letter T, that would be big T. So the little t means that there's going to be the two recessive alleles. So this is going to have bobtails. This cat is going to have bobtails. If you have a dominant and a recessive, the dominant's going to win, and the dominant is no bobtails. So I'm going to write just no. Big T is two dominants, and dominant is no bobtails. So again, that's going to be no. So you've got to pay attention to what you're told is recessive and dominant, and go from there. Here we're going to do the reverse. Now we're given the phenotype, the trait, the physical trait, and we need to figure out the genotype. So I'm just going to pick a letter here. And I'm going to pick something that looks different. So I'm not going to pick S or C. I'm going to pick H for hair. Okay? So here's dominant, here's recessive. Straight is dominant, because it tells you right here. Curly is recessive. So here's straight, here's curly. So if you have straight hair, you have to have at least one big H. So one way you can have it is two big H's. That'll give you straight hair. Or you can have a big H and a little h, which is still going to give you straight hair. The only time you can have curly hair is if you have two of the recessives. So you have to have little h, little h. And again, I apologize for my handwriting. Here you have pointed heads are dominant. Round heads are recessive. I'm going to use H again. So here's pointed, which is dominant. Here's round, which is recessive. So pointed, again, you can have big H, big H. That'll make pointed phenotype. You can also have big H, little h. Since the big H is dominant, that means pointed head's still going to win, so you can still be pointed. The only time you can get round is if you have two recessive alleles. So little h, because round is recessive and pointed is dominant. Okay, so hopefully this makes sense with some practice. Hopefully you have the vocab down. And this is kind of the basics you need to get to kind of understand the rest of the unit.